So you are at this ironical and paradoxical situation where both Washington and Beijing have, for their own very different reasons, an interest in the weakening of the India-Russia relationship.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh. Revi. Today we're discussing Prime Minister Narendra Modi's annual summit with the President Vladimir Putin in Moscow with Ambassador Pankaj Saran. He's the convener of NatStrat. He's a current member of the National Security Advisory Board. Previously has been India's deputy NSA and India's envoy to Russia. I'm against like bad pennies, or should I say, I can't even use the...
No, you're on good pennies.
Yes,
so we're back again together, yes, for another show. Thank you for...
Thanks for finding the time. When you look at, say, the optics and the outcomes of what we saw happen over the couple of days there, it's not just India and Russia's bilateral relations being looked at by those two countries. I mean, the whole world's eyes are on that, especially when the NATO Summit is going on at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm surprised. I mean, having been involved in the relationship in some way or the other for many, many years, I've never seen the relationship attract so much attention as it is doing today, and mostly for wrong reasons. I mean, I don't think this is a visit which deserves headlines because, all you're doing is continuing your friendship with an old partner. I would have said that a headline would be created if you were doing something completely new, like, say, for example, making peace with China or breaking new ground with Pakistan. I mean, that would, from an Indian point of view, be a huge step forward. But to continue the relationship with Russia, I think it's par for the course. And, everything that has happened in the visit is exactly what has happened in the past summits. So in a sense, there's nothing extraordinary at all about the visit. And if it has attracted attention, I mean, you mentioned the NATO. So are we supposed to stop our foreign policy interactions because it's NATO's 75th anniversary? I don't understand the logic. What happened in the 70th anniversary of NATO, the 50th anniversary of NATO? I mean, NATO there exists. It will go through its motions and its summit processes, but it doesn't mean that a country like India should, stop in its tracks or look left and right and so on. I think this is a new India where you pursue policy which you think is in your interest, as long as it doesn't disturb others or doesn't derail the global order. It is not disruptive. It does not kind of add or to fuel to the fire or contribute to global instability. I think we've made it known publicly and privately to everyone who wants to listen that the whole purpose of the visit, what was the purpose of the visit? I mean, clearly it was, as I said, a continuation of an age-old partnership. But when it comes to, say, a conflict like Ukraine, and we're not talking about Gaza or Yemen or the Houthis and other, flashpoints in the world which are taking far more lives than Ukraine, what we've said to everyone is that the whole attempt is to diffuse tensions. It's not to aggravate tension. And I think this message seems to not being getting heard as much as it should, and it bears repetition many, many times. That here is a country which actually has the ability to talk to all parties to this most unfortunate conflict and to counsel them that, you need to de-escalate, you need to wind down, you need to return to the negotiating table. And so, in my view, the parties to the conflict should actually feel slightly more at ease that someone is taking the risk and going there and trying to talk to the leadership about the need to de-escalate. I think this intention and this ability are both of great value at the point where we sit. Otherwise, what is the option? I don't understand. I mean, is the option to continue the fight and the battle and the war till the last Ukrainian or till the last Russian. Because the point is, today we seem to be stuck, globally speaking, to see this conflict between the mightiest and the richest of the world. And where does that leave the vast majority of the nations, like India and everyone else, who are basically saying, so what happened to our issues? And what we are witnessing, because we are unfortunately mute spectators of what is happening, is that the issues of importance to us have been completely sidelined. And at most we have lip service being paid. So you have enough money to fund and fuel and provide weapons to Ukraine, which run into billions of dollars, but you do not have the same funds to participate in the climate change challenges of the least developing and the developing world. So the world is unequal. I'm not saying India has taken or should take a moral position, but what I'm saying is morality lies in the eyes of the beholder. And if India has to go to Russia or to continue its relationship with Russia, it does not mean in any way that this constitutes a support to what Russia has done. So I would look at it like that. In my opinion, this is actually not a headline-making visit. It is simply a continuation of a process that the Indians have been living with and have taken as a part of the established foreign policy of India.
I'm saying that this annual summit is just a continuation of an age-old friendship, and it does not count as support for Russia's war in Ukraine against Ukraine. But there are critics who say India has never condemned it, say. But how do you put in perspective what happened? President Zelensky's statement on social media, he's also at the NATO Summit, of course, and then the Prime Minister's remarks which were publicly made. I mean, even the public could hear them, and subsequently even in the one-on-one, the ministry made it clear as to what had transpired in the conversation about Ukraine between the Prime Minister and President Putin.
Yeah, so firstly on the Prime Minister's remarks, I think these were deliberate. The idea was to convey a message in public, in the full glare, and he has done that. I mean, he didn't mince any words, and I think President Putin heard him. And this is exactly what all of us had expected would happen when our Prime Minister would go to Moscow. So I don't think there's any surprises there about the message. I mean, what else do you think he would have told President Putin? That continue fighting or don't make peace with the West. I mean, this is logical, a human reaction to any conflict. So that is on the first part. Secondly, on the reaction of President Zelensky, etc. Look, we've all gone through these difficult periods when we've had our land under occupation of the Chinese or by the Pakistanis. And we've seen Western leaders go to Beijing or to Islamabad. We don't, get so...
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
The Chinese going to Western capital.
Yes, but I was looking more in terms of, say...
Their reaction, yes.
Macron or Scholtz or the Americans visiting Beijing in the last 1 year, when Beijing is sitting on Indian occupied territory. So what is the reaction from India? I mean, we see all this. So I think there is if you have to go by this yardstick, then no one is holier than the other. And insofar as his reaction is concerned, yes, I mean, it is expected. Naturally, he's emotional. He's upset. But the fact of the matter is that our Prime Minister and India has pursued a policy of engagement with everyone, including with him. Just a few weeks ago in Italy, and with the G7.
There was a hug there as well.
There was a hug. So I don't, on the hug issue, this is a standard manner in which the Prime Minister, it's a personal thing.
Correct.
I mean, it may not apply to some other Prime Minister, and we've seen a lot of Indian Prime Ministers. So I think it's a personal issue, and I wouldn't get down to that level of how, he conducts himself. But the fact of the matter is, India's engagement has been universal with all sides to the conflict, whether it's the Europeans, whether it is NATO, whether it's the United States, whether it's Ukraine. I mean, much the same way, for example, as we have done in the case of the Gaza conflict. After all, there are people who make many allegations against Israeli military action in Gaza, against Prime Minister Netanyahu. But yet you find in the last many months, there's been a stream of senior American officials pouring into Israel. But for what purpose? To try and make peace. So similarly, if Prime Minister Modi visits Moscow, the message he's carrying as a friend of Putin and a friend of Russia, of the West, is to say, look, we think as India, if you think our voice matters, if you think what I'm saying makes sense to you, let us try and reduce the levels of tension. I think this is a great service that is being done, because I don't see a second option except for continuation of the conflict and the war. The Swiss and the Ukrainians themselves have tried, and I have been trying through this so-called peace process. Why are they doing that? And India has taken the right position that, and I've heard the US comment about Ukraine, to have a just and a sustainable peace. So what does just peace mean? What does sustainable peace mean? It means that the parties, all the parties to the conflict, have to be a part of the peace process. You cannot have exclusion of one and expect a just peace. You can have a peace, but whether it will be just and whether it will sustain is a different issue. So, in my opinion, I think there's nothing wrong, if I were to put it in that sense, or anything for India to be defensive about for a visit to Russia. We have to keep in mind the fundamental point that Russia is not an adversary of India. It has never been, and it is not today. And there is no reason why India should play an extremely risky game of converting a friend into an adversary. I don't see any country in the world doing that, and I don't see why we should do it. So that's how I look at the visit.
You were talking about China in the context of Western leaders, say, visiting China, considering the situation India and China find themselves in. So how is India, in your view, Ambassador, navigating the situation vis-a-vis China, and how Russia is dealing with China, and how India is an age-old friend of Russia?
Yeah, so this trilateral dynamic between Russia, India, China is again as old as history. It's only come into focus today because of various events, some beyond our control. So clearly the Russian move towards China has been driven by the US and NATO perception of Russia and China and painting them in the same brush. And therefore, from their perspective, they see Russia and China as both as adversarial countries. And that is driving both. And what would you expect, therefore, that if you paint them in the same brush, they will have this tendency to move together and to gang up. So that's one thing. But when it comes to India, as against the US or Europe, we have a different perspective. And I think this is extremely important so that everyone understands that our people, the rest of the world, you see, frankly, who has a stake or who seems to be interested in, let us say, a breakdown or a deterioration of the India-Russia relationship? Clearly, we know that the West would like the India-Russia relationship to atrophy, to weaken, to somehow get disrupted. But the other party, which is equally interested in this outcome, is the Chinese. Because the Chinese would like the weakening of the India-Russia relationship. So you are at this ironical and paradoxical situation where both Washington and Beijing have, for their own very different reasons, an interest in the weakening of the India-Russia relationship. But the maintenance of the relationship is vital for both Russia and India. And again, for very different reasons. So the path to the end point may be different, but the end point remains that there is a mutuality in both Delhi and Moscow to continue and preserve this relationship. And there is interest in both the United States and China, for their own reasons, geopolitically, to see this relationship suffer. And I feel that we have to be focused on what our interests are, Indian interests, and pursue those. While at the same time, and we repeated this ad nauseum, maintaining our relationship with the West. Now, everyone has to adjust to these new realities. Everyone, whether it's Washington or Brussels or Delhi or Beijing or Russia, because that is exactly where we are today in the world. There are no absolutes, and everything is in a state of uncertainty. Everyone is balancing, everyone is hedging, because if that was not the case, why should we have had a stream of visitors from the West to China? I don't understand. Why should Vietnam have been in play, and Southeast Asia, and everyone else? So it's not just India which is doing it. I think that is really today the nature of the being, that we are in this situation where everyone is preparing themselves for maybe a future which is not yet visible, but also trying to secure interests. But the difference between India and China in this kind of a fluidity is that India would like to preserve an international order and a rules-based order, whereas the Chinese are looking and biding their time till such time as they overtake the existing primary power in the world, which is the United States. India is not in that league at all.
Yeah.
And the second thing, I think, which is fundamental to this whole business and this discussion and the reaction to the visit is, everyone has to understand this very simple fact, which is getting missed deliberately, is that Russia is a friend, China is an adversary. Russia does not have a common border, China has a common border. As far as Delhi is concerned, you cannot equate Moscow with Beijing. Yes, when it comes to looking at the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, obviously India is watching what contours it will have, what will be the drivers of that, what will be the military dimension, or let's say the security dimension of the relationship. And you have to leave it and give some, credibility to Indian decision makers that they are also watching what everyone else is watching. But the responses to certain developments take different forms, and I think that's where we are. And I think time will tell whether the Indian approach was right or not. I think the Indians are convinced that the way they're going about it is the most mature and sensible way. Supposing I ask you tomorrow, in the course of the Modi 3.0, there is a serious attempt to move towards normalization with China, how would the West react? Would they be equally perturbed, equally angry, equally upset? Or would they welcome reduction of India-China tensions? These are questions which have to be asked. I mean, nothing is fixed in global politics, and of course we would like a resolution to this conflict in Ukraine. It's been going on for decades. The war may have begun 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, but I separate the war from the conflict. And the conflict, in my opinion, dates back to the fallout of the 1991 breakup.
Sure.
So, it doesn't mean that till such time as you have a final solution to the conflict, that we cease our normal day-to-day foreign policy activities. And this applies even to issues like sanctions and payments and everything else.
Yeah. So, like, one of the issues you were talking about is how the West is not as imperious or impervious or is disregarding India's interests and the larger world's interests because of the impact from the war in Ukraine. And one of them would have been petroleum. So if you just look at, in Prime Minister, I think in one of his statements, two public statements talked about it, that the West or the global rich have benefited indirectly because of India's buying discounted petroleum from Russia. But the larger point in terms of what we know publicly that has been released between India and Russia seems to be, I'm not sure whether there's a movement, but there's a lot of discussion of different routes, the Arctic route, they're talking about Vladivostok, Chennai, apart from INSTC.
Yeah, that's interesting in my opinion, that they seem to be moving forward. So just to disaggregate, so on the energy question, obviously, it is of existential importance to India. If you are an economy which is dependent on 80 to 90% of your energy imports, what will any political government in India do? You have no option, whether you're Japan or whether you're China or whether you're India, you are dependent on the global suppliers. And your first order of business is going to be to secure your energy supplies. Why do you think we're building strategic reserves and this and that? And why do you think also we are trying to secure assets wherever we can find them to guarantee continued supply till such time as you declare energy independence, which is also a stated goal of the United States, to declare independence from hydrocarbon. So that is on one side. There, I think it's a non-negotiable, more or less, because if you do not have energy, you can forget about growing at 8% a year.
Sure.
It's as simple as that. You will have civil war. I mean, if your energy prices shoot up, that will lead to food inflation and everything else. But what I find interesting also is this new kind of sensibility that has come about in the India-Russia of looking to the future, of, let us say, leveraging Russia's geography for India's benefit, for mutual benefit. And this is where I find a slightly more nuanced and enhanced focus interesting on the Russian Far East and the Arctic, and particularly the Northern Sea route. I think that's really interesting. And again, if on the one hand, India is talking about India of 2047, and if you simply work the figures backwards, it won't be very difficult to find out what your requirements are going to be in 2047, both in terms of quantity and in terms of maybe in this case, the routes by which they come. There are so many studies which show, for example, the Arctic melting in the next 20-30 years, the possibility of a greater opening of the Northern Sea route. Already there is some trade that is flowing on the in the summer months. And of course the Russian Far East. I mean, everyone has their eyes on the Russian Far East. The Chinese, to start with.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all over the place. And the Russians don't like it. The Japanese are deeply interested. The Koreans are deeply interested. And I don't see why we should not be, because the Russian Far East contains all the imaginable resources you can think of in the world. And if we have to have any chance of access to those resources, you need a friendly Moscow. You are not going to get there if you have a hostile Moscow. So this is interesting because you're talking of coking coal, of diamonds, of fresh water, timber. I mean, there are so many things out there which are waiting to be used for mutual benefits. I think that's really a good move forward. Obviously, there is disruption in the normal India-Russia economic and trade cooperation because of the sanctions. There's no secret. I mean, Indian companies are shy, just as Chinese companies are shy of getting in. But we have to find alternative ways.
So one of the things, again, that progressed in terms of discussion, we don't know about outcomes, is complementary kind of exchange in national currencies. But trade now, petroleum would form a major amount of trade, and we've seen the multiple manifold jump in India-Russia trade primarily because of that. President Putin, I think, bandied around some number 60% in last year and 20% increase in trade just in the first quarter, majorly because of petroleum, of course. They've put $100 billion thing, but I don't think that would be very difficult. It's already 65 billion. But there's an imbalance there, which also India is trying to sort out, right? A deficit.
The reality is that the imbalance issue, India has to live with even with China.
Correct.
You're today facing it with Russia. The fact of the matter is, you have to find items that you can export. whether it is to Russia, whether it is to China, whether it is to anyone else. The fact of the matter is that this is a domestic challenge for India. How do you create services and goods which you can actually export? So it was good that in the 9-point program of economic cooperation, they have upfront talked about 2-3 things which for me are interesting. Removal of non-tariff barriers, non-tariff hurdles, phytosanitary, food, agriculture, these have actually been impeding, and a lot of this is coming from Russia. So I think there was a fairly significant pushback by the Indians to say, listen, you have to do something to increase Indian exports to Russia. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you have to create also more awareness among the Indian exporting community about the status of the Russian market. And lastly, I would say, how do you trade? Is it barter? Is it the hard currency? Is it national currency? So what are the messaging services you use? Is it there's an alternative to SWIFT? So these are big issues, and these have to be resolved. And I think it's good that they are focused on these issues. They're not kind of trying to push them under the carpet. But yes, beyond a point, you cannot have a sustainable trade kind of relationship unless there is some balance in it. And we face the same problem with Iran, actually. There were, the huge amounts of energy exports. So we have to find ways. It's very important to find ways to increase our exports, to balance trade. And as I said, the tools for the trade, equally important.
And on the energy front, there have been, again, a lot of discussion and proposals, how far they've gone in terms of reaching outcomes as yet on the nuclear energy cooperation front.
Yeah. Look, as it so happens, the heavy lifting for India's, the lifting of nuclear sanctions on India in 2008 was done by the Americans. And this was acknowledged by the Indian government of that time and continues to be acknowledged today. That was a historic breakthrough that India achieved. Russia played a part, but not a major part. It didn't block. It went along with the American exercise, which is remarkable. That here you had both the Americans and the Russians almost together. The only outlier was China. It's a lesson for us today. We need to think back on what the dynamic was. But what has happened in the process is that the only nuclear power plants that have come up in India are Russian. They're not American, they're not French, they're not anyone else. So the nuclear cooperation between India and Russia also dates back. One of the things which has to be said about the Russians is that even when India was under sanctions, the Russians continued with their nuclear cooperation with India in the widest sense of the term, civil nuclear cooperation. And that is something which is today standing us in good stead in Kudankulam. Now, of course, I saw the Rosatom, and I think the Prime Minister's visit to Rosatom is interesting, very interesting. As far as I'm aware, the Rosatom is probably the largest company, civil nuclear company in the world, with the maximum number of international projects all across the world. Whether it's Turkey, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Saudi, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is China. So their operations are really truly global. So the Russians have come up with various ideas for the next stage of nuclear cooperation. For example, the closed nuclear fuel cycle, floating nuclear reactors, and many, many other aspects. So this is something I'm sure the Indians will look at, because the Indians also have their own indigenous nuclear power program. And if you have to achieve climate change targets, you have to ensure that you have all sources of energy, including nuclear. So yes, I think this is one of the largest importers of uranium, Russian uranium, are the Americans.
Yeah. So initially there were no sanctions against.
And there were no sanctions.
I think subsequently there has been something. But anyway, it's interesting also, I find, Ambassador, that so late in this discussion we've come to the defense and security aspect of India. Now I don't know whether it is purposeful direction from the people who are involved in diplomacy, or whether that's actually happening. But how much of an issue is it, the Russia-Ukraine war, supplies, whether it's spare parts or even big projects?
Look, I think there are three parts to this.
Yeah.
Number one is this whole business of diversification.
Correct.
Number two is this question of the stock that you maintain. And number three is the future. So if I come to the question of diversification, let us be clear that the diversification of India's defense imports began in 2010. There was no Ukraine at that time. That was the heydays of the US-Russia friendship. So having some tensions are beginning, but the diversification began from that stage. And there was a logic why India wanted to diversify. It wanted to reduce dependence on the one hand, but it also wanted access to the best technology available. And that technology became available only after 2008, after the lifting of all the sanctions against India. So that's on the diversification, and that process has accelerated. In terms of, if you look at how much you were purchasing from the United States then and today, you see the differences. The figures speak for themselves. That leaves the question of the stock. No government in India can afford to junk those stocks. You can't. 60-70%. They have to be maintained. So today, the primary dialogue, as far as I know, with the Russians relates only to the question of serviceability and of upgradation. And we've told them many, many times for the last many years, you have to shift your facilities, part with your technology so that we can, manufacture the spares, do the servicing, do the upgradation in India, not there. And a lot of it is beginning to happen. And the third is the future. When it comes to the future, the last big deal, I think, with the Russians was the AK-203. But even when you look at the AK as an example, the primary standout was the level of indigenization. The Indians were non-compromising. You have to indigenize. You can have a pathway to indigenization, but the endpoint has to be 100% indigenization. So when you look at the future acquisitions from Russia, it's going to be a function of your budget. Do you have the money to pay? They don't come for free. Number two, quality of the Russian technology. And number three, how it fits in with your rest of your inventory today. And this whole question of making sure that all your partners, whether it's the Americans, the French, the Israelis, or the Spanish, or anyone else, are comfortable and confident that there will be preservation of classified information, etc., etc. So, but in the long term, if we are serious about Atmanirbharta and defense indigenization, we really have to shift and invest those thousands of crores in India and not allow all that big money to go overseas. So it is going to be, and it will remain, a trade-off between the kind of technology you want and the objective of building your own domestic base. I think that policy trade-off will remain, and it is nothing abnormal. I think it is part and parcel of growing up.
One particular, I don't know what to call it, a hurdle or a stumbling block between India and Russia has been whether it's Indians going willingly or being tricked into going and serving in the Russian army or being helpers in the Russian army. There have been deaths as well, and that issue has been a bit prickly, but we were told again publicly that there's a process involved in getting both of them back, and the Prime Minister had raised it with President Putin.
Yeah, so that's unfortunate, basically. But I read also that they are talking about a migration and a mobility agreement. This is a problem which we are facing with not just Russia, but with European countries, where we have people who have been misled by migration rackets and mafias, and who have been, become victims of human trafficking. So some of it is problems we have to correct on our own, and to, stop the leakages within our own country. And then where we find that someone has been tricked into activities which are blatantly wrong, then the only thing we have to do is to request the government to return them back or not to encourage. So I think in this case it is serious that you've had Indians who have, by design or otherwise, been tricked into this, and that's unfortunate. And I think it arouses a lot of feelings here of having been wronged, because that's the last thing you want. But having said all that, I think in the long term, just as the Indians have contributed to the development of the Gulf and the Western world, I think there is a lot of potential. And we are signing today, we are looking at sending Indian manpower to Taiwan and so many other countries. Israel. We should, because there is a huge demographic challenge in Russia. If there is one challenge they face, it is demographic. And I think there is a lot of potential for Indian skilled, semi-skilled labor and manpower to go to Russia, to contribute to the growth of that economy. And the evidence is that wherever the Indians have gone, they've done really well.
Is there also a potential for Russia in the global stage to be seen or actually be more assertive? What I mean by that is the US entering its presidential election phase, many would say lame duck phase. That's the time where Russia can take advantage. Plus, there's also a possibility of Trump returning. So how do you see Russia in the near future? I mean, I'm talking about this year on the global stage.
Yeah, the question is whether Russia will be even more risk-taking than it has already been. I think there's a lot of international pressure. I mean, if someone like India can tell Russia, look, basically wind down, that is the message which I think the Russians would have taken. I personally don't expect Russia to take any more risks in the next few months prior to the US election. If they read the sense in the room, because once the NATO summit is over, we can expect some extremely strident statements coming out. So at least I hope they do not take more risks. And of course, Putin had made a statement a few days ago that he will wait till the US election to begin negotiations or talks. It is possible that the Russians are waiting and maybe hoping for a Trump victory, because when Trump was president, the relationship between Russia and America was not as tense as it is today. And Trump and his other Republican candidates have been on record to say that they do not agree with the Biden policy on Russia and on Ukraine. They do not agree with parking 100 or 200 billions of dollars to Ukraine. They want to invest it in their own country. So there is disagreement within the American political establishment on the policy towards Russia and Ukraine. And much more than us is the Europeans who are worried. So I think everyone is, and there's not much time left in any case. In 3 months from now, you will have a new US president. So I think it's a holding operation right now.
Ambassador Pankaj Saran, as usual, thanks for letting us pick your brains over a nice 30-minute talk.
Thank you, Amitabh. Always a pleasure. And thank you for inviting me so often to your shows. Thank you so much.
Pleasure with us. Thanks.
Thanks.
And to all our viewers, do send us feedback on this particular interview. You can watch all our social media handles for the latest articles that we put up on our website, or interviews like this with Ambassador Saran on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.